Good morning. My name is Jeff Dunn. I'm Vice President and Director of the San Jacinto Battleground Association. And on behalf of our association, I welcome you to the 9th Annual Battle of San Jacinto Symposium. I appreciate you coming out in the weather today, but we're going to have a great morning and afternoon. And want to tell you first a little bit about the purpose of the symposium. We started this in the year 2001 to help bring together some of the most outstanding scholars in the country around the anniversary, the April 21st anniversary of San Jacinto, to help create a record of cutting-edge research on the Battle of San Jacinto, the Mexican period of Texas, Texas independence, and the Republic of Texas period in early statehood. Today's theme is New Light on Old Stories, and we have a wonderful lineup of speakers, and in the afternoon we'll have an archaeological presentation, which, if you've been reading the newspapers, has received national coverage over the last few days. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize our sponsors, the Summerlee Foundation, the Humanities Texas, a division of the National Humanities, Sterling Bank, and we also are grateful to the San Jacinto Museum of History Association for a donation for a teacher's scholarship. By the way, how many teachers do we have here today? Very good. Thank you very much for coming out. Also like to bring your attention to the program. There is a list of donors and also a list of the members of the symposium committee. This event each year is organized by volunteers. We have no paid staff. Dave Britton is the chair of the committee this year, and if you see people walking around with a green ribbon saying committee, they are part of the team that helps put this together. I'd also like to recognize the patrons. They're also listed on the program. They've helped provide a little additional financial contribution to help make this program possible. The Friends of the San Jacinto Battleground is a nonprofit Section 501c3 organization, and the mission of the group is to preserve, protect, and reclaim the San Jacinto Battleground, to help educate the public about the Battle of San Jacinto and the Texas Revolution period, and to help promote and support commemorative activities, including San Jacinto Day events at the battlefield, as well as the reenactment. We also do archaeology and a number of other scholarship endeavors as well. During the day today, please remember to keep your cell phones off while you're in the room. Also, we also do not permit video except for authorized video. This event will be taped for later broadcast by Houston Media. And now we have just a few other announcements. First of all, I would like to welcome a few distinguished guests that we have here today. One is Congressman John Culberson. I'm very glad to have him here. In addition, we have Ben Carmine and Dave Knox from NRG. We appreciate you being here as well. Also, Commissioner Sylvia Garcia, who is a commissioner from East Harris County. And you want to come up and say a few words? Commissioner Garcia is always very gracious in welcoming everybody here, and we'd like to give her this opportunity today.
Thank you, Jeff. And where is Congressman Culberson? Is he? He's running late. Well, so many of us have been, haven't we, because of the weather, and I really, really appreciate all of y'all being here this morning, because I know all of us have perhaps had a few challenges getting here. And I'm told that the storm is coming, but it'll be a bright, sunny day tomorrow. And only in Houston, Harris County can we have that kind of change of weather. So my job this morning is simple, is to welcome you here in behalf of Harris County. I can tell you that all of us are delighted that you continue to have your symposium, have it here, and be about preserving and protecting all our history in the area. For me, I'm absolutely delighted that it all started in my precinct because as commissioner, I represent everything from downtown to Baytown, and then from downtown to Clear Lake area, the Bay Area. And I've worked real hard to make sure that we can do our part as the county in protecting the area around us that is within Harris County. So what I'd like to do is just give you a glimpse of some of the things that we're doing. I know that, and I appreciate the title of your symposium this year is New Light on Old Stories. And that is a great turn of a phrase, but to those of us in this room, I don't think some stories ever get old. The work done by presenters today continues to entertain and to educate. I find it interesting to look at all of the artwork this time period has inspired, so much of it inspired by creation of something new, in this case, a new republic. We speak of armies and nations and cultures. The history we review on days like today reminds us that we are really speaking about individuals and the strength of the character that they were. Whether black, brown, or white, they all stood together for their own beliefs, and more importantly, they stood on their courage. Without the research that you will all continue to support, we may never have known Pamelia Mann Dixon. In fact, she is remembered in one of the epic art pieces erected through the Economic Alliance Port Region in a project that I've spoken to you about for the last 3 or 4 years called Project Stars. Two Storms Passing is the name of the artwork erected on 2 tanks at Shell Deer Park facility. And you could, it's, can you see Pamelia and the oxen? It's a little fuzzy, but this is one of 2 tanks side by side. They depict the Texan Army just after he has made his decision to head towards San Jacinto. There in the background of the piece is Mrs. Mann, not wanting her oxen to be led to a battleground. She forcibly removed the twin sisters from the yoke of her cattle, and she led them home. Ladies, I first thought when I saw this that once again, as usual, the ladies had to do all the hard work. I was very, very promptly corrected by the historian on our task force and said, that's not what it is, Commissioner, but you're close. Because, of course, we've got to be not only politically correct these days, but historically correct for this project. Some renditions say that the officer sent by General Sam Houston came back a little bloodied. She went on to open the Mansion House Hotel on the corner of Congress and Milam, and to my delight, I can see the old building still sitting on Market Square from my downtown office, just 2 blocks from my office. Based on what I've read and seen, she ran what I would call a pretty typical frontier or boomtown establishment. She died in 1840, only 3 years after coming to Houston, but the value of her estate had tripled to more than $40,000. Today, that would be a lot of money, and what a great corporate executive I'm sure she would have been. Anyway, I simply love reliving old stories. I know that's what you do too, and that's why you're here. And it is the research that comes out of this symposium that will continue to bring more and more rich history and more stories for us to tell our children. I thank all of the presenters today. I thank the patrons. I thank all the organizers, and more importantly, I thank this group for all the work that you're doing. And for those of you who have time to visit our area and want to go through the real storms today, I strongly urge you to go down 45 south, take the 225 turn, and go see all the 4 tanks with epic art. The first one would be off of Scarborough, exit off of 225, and it's called Destiny. The next, if you keep on going and then exit on Center Street, you can make a U-turn. And this one, side by side, a second one, is called Two Storms Passing. Then keep on coming back toward town and exit on Battleground Road, now called Independence Parkway. And you can see on the left a tank called Discovery. Those are 4 of what many more to come, so that we can truly send a message graphically of what this history is all about. We will continue to work on our project, and as the years come by, I will continue to update you on the things that we are doing. Again, welcome to Houston-Harris County. Have a great time and a great successful conference. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia. Also, I want to point out, if you've missed it, we have a cannon in the back of the room. And Greg, do you want to tell us just a little bit about that?
All right, very quickly, we want to make sure to give you some information on the cannon that's in the back. It's a bronze 4-pound cannon. It's got a Spanish coat of arms. It was probably cast in Mexico about 1750. It weighs about 375 pounds without the carriage. There are some cannonballs there. Those are not the right size cannonballs. Those are for good looks. This cannon, it's very interesting. It's possible it's an Alamo cannon. We're not saying it is. The destruction that's done to it, the trunnions knocked off, the cascabels knocked off, the trunnions are knocked off, the handles are knocked off, are very similar to damage that was done to the Alamo cannons by the Mexican Army as they left San Antonio. It's very briefly the history of how in the world we think it could be an Alamo cannon is that this cannon was discovered in Philadelphia, and supposedly there was a company in Philadelphia, that French company, that some San Antonio person, unknown person, owed them money and sent them this cannon. I know it's weak, but we're starting to chase it down, and we actually have some fairly good information. We have found a relative of this French family. There were two Frenches. One of them founded Smith, Klein, and French. But we have found a relative, and she remembers the cannon being in the yard of their country home, and she remembers her grandmother always saying that was an Alamo cannon. We don't have the provenance of getting the cannon from San Antonio to Philadelphia, but we're looking for it. This cannon was bought in an auction from the Texas State Historical Association as a possible Alamo cannon back in the 80s. It was bought by John Alexander McRae, and it was donated by his daughter, Sue Elizabeth McRae. And she's donated it to our friends group. We're going to put it at the Alamo. The carriage is not original. I want to recognize a couple people that have been really important. Gary Wiggins. Gary, would you stand up? Gary Wiggins has been very instrumental in moving this cannon, which, as you can imagine, is not a small thing. They brought it from North Texas to A&M where it's been conserved. It's only 60% finished, but it's going to be taken back to A&M to complete and then end up at the Alamo. Raymond Cruz and Jim Struhall helped Gary. And the main person is Rick Range. Rick, would you stand up real quickly? Rick Range found an article about this cannon and about the auction, and he chased down this cannon, and he is a bulldog. Anybody that's worked with Rick Range, he got these people to donate the cannon, and I can't tell the whole story, but it's a fascinating story, and it was amazing that he got this cannon donated. So thanks to Rick.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, both Rick and Gary. Moderating our symposium today is Dr. James E. Crisp. Jim has moderated the symposium every year since 2003. He is an associate professor of history at North Carolina State University. He is a native of Texas. He went to Rice and Yale, married a Texas girl, but is not teaching Texas history at North Carolina State. But we're always glad that he comes back here every year to moderate this symposium because he adds a great deal of expertise and knowledge to the subject matter. He is author of Sleuthing the Alamo, which won the T.R. Fehrenbach Award from the Texas Historical Commission in 2006, and later this year he will be publishing a biographical essay on Jose Antonio Navarro. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Crisp, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome. It's good to be back. I won't say that I've been elected moderator for life, but it's beginning to feel that way. Today, I'm going to not take a lot of your time, but I do want to, as I usually do at this time each year, ask you to think in somewhat thematic terms about what you're about to hear, what it all means when you put it together. The official title for today's symposium in 2009 is New Light on Old Stories, and I think that's absolutely accurate. But another thing I want you to be thinking about is historical imagination. I think some people get the idea that those of us who are academic historians sit around smoking something that's appropriate to our generation and just kind of cooking up stories, things we'd like to say and like to be true and throw out there to see how much controversy we can create. I've been accused of that myself. But historical imagination is absolutely essential to doing good history, trying to pick up those fragments of evidence and understand what they might mean and where they might lead. Every answer to every historical question produces another question or two or three or a dozen, and then we go out searching for answers to those. In particular today, we're not only looking at historians and archaeologists who have imagined what might be out there for them to find, but we're also going to be looking at the people who right here in this part of the world in 1835 and 36 were using their imagination, imagining a victory on the part of Sam Houston, imagining a nation perhaps on the part of those who financed the Texas Revolution, imagining what they must have been doing and how their fight related to the American Revolution, which was so much a part of their collective memory and their collective identity. I once told my students that if you saw four guys firing a rifle from a wall in the Texas Revolution on the rebel side, chances are you had four different versions of what they were fighting about. And four different versions of what the war was all about. There wasn't a consensus and unanimity then, and don't expect to find a consensus and unanimity now on a single meaning of the Texas Revolution. Bill Brands and Sam Haynes and Jim Bevel are going to be talking this morning about some of the historical, some of the imagination that was being used in the 1830s as Texas as a nation, even as a temporary nation in Sam Houston's mind, was being conceived. And then this afternoon, of course, we're going to turn to the archaeology, which we'll talk about more later, but I think you'll see how in the minds of the archaeologist, imagination, especially historical imagination, is critical. Our first speaker this morning, our leadoff hitter, is Bill Brands from the University of Texas. If you are a victim of insomnia like I am and use C-SPAN as your therapy, then you will have certainly have seen Bill as I have. I once heard him say on one of those television productions that one of his first attempts to get something published was a massive history of the United States from start to finish, and of course they said no. And so what he's been doing in his 22, I think it is now, books since then is writing that massive history of the United States piece by piece, looking at great presidents, looking at great events like the Gold Rush and the Texas Revolution, and being a master writer and a master teacher of taking history not only to the classroom but also to the wider world. What Bill is going to be talking about today is, as I put it to him last night, what was he thinking? That is to say, what was Sam Houston thinking as he began to develop a strategy or a desperate out, or whatever else you think he might have been trying to do as he zigzagged eastward across Texas in the spring of 1836. I would like you to please welcome the Dixon Allen Anderson Centennial Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin, H.W. Bill Brands.
Thanks, Jim, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I have to say, though, that it is with some trepidation that I address a group like this, because I'm not from Texas, and I didn't grow up learning the Texas history that most of you learned. Let me ask you, how many of you took that standard Texas history course in 7th grade? Okay, so you've all got a big edge on me, because I wasn't here in 7th grade, and I didn't get that. And I know from personal experience how expert students can become, students of Texas history become in the 7th grade. I gave a talk a few years ago in Midland, and I was there actually to speak at Midland College, but my host asked me if I would be willing to talk to a couple of classes of 7th graders the next morning? And I said, sure, that'd be great. So I modified my talk a little bit for the 7th graders. And then the teachers who brought the classes asked me if I'd be willing to entertain questions. Of course, I said, I'm always happy to entertain questions. And I could tell right off that the students had been assigned by their teachers to pose questions. They had to write questions down. And it was kind of a game of stump the prof. And it turned out to be easy pickings. Kind of. Because one of the endearing things about 7th graders, when they really get into their Texas history courses, and they usually do, is how they amass certain kinds of information. It's often certain very specific information. Now, one of the things that the 7th graders lack is perspective and weighing the relative, what shall I say, importance of particular aspects of history. Now, I say that all by way of apology for the fact that the first question stumped me. And it was one that never had occurred to me, but there it was. So the question was, Professor Brands, and see, as I told them, and I'll tell you now by way of, again, explanation as to why I'm here, I come at the story of Texas history from the perspective of American history. I'm an American historian, and it has long occurred to me, or certainly since I've been in Texas, that the Texas story as a subset of the American story is absolutely fascinating in its own terms. I initially studied American history in the 20th century, and so I was introduced to Texas through, and my field was American foreign policy. I was introduced to Texas through Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson, as you all know and can appreciate, was quite a character. And I recall a story. I was doing some research at the LBJ Library in Austin, and Ted Gittinger, who's one of the archivists there, told me the story about Lyndon Johnson that I've been using ever since. And I thought, well, this really summarizes both Johnson's view on the world and, to a certain extent, Texans' view of the importance of Texas. And the story is this. It took place in the Democratic primary campaign of 1960. Lyndon Johnson was one of 3 leading Democratic candidates. The other 2 were John Kennedy of Massachusetts and Stuart Symington of Missouri. And the 3 of them were getting ready for a debate. It was going to be one of the candidates' debates. And they were waiting in the green room just ahead of everybody. They were going to set up the cameras, and they were going to all go out and address the group. And Kennedy turns to Symington and Johnson and says, Stu, Lyndon, I have to tell you, I had a dream last night. And in this dream, God reached down from heaven and tapped me on the shoulder. And he said, Jack, you're my boy. You're going to win the primary. You're going to win the election. You're going to be the next president of the United States. And Stuart Symington got a puzzled look on his face, and he turned to Kennedy, and he turned to Johnson, and he said, I don't know. This is very strange, because I had a dream last night, and God reached down from heaven and tapped me on the shoulder and said, Stu, this is your year. You're going to win the primary and the election. You're going to be the next president of the United States. Johnson stood there, and he looked at Kennedy, and he looked at Symington, and he shook his head, and he had those jowls, and jowls started to flap a little bit, and he had those ears, and the ears waved, and he got really close to Kennedy and then to Symington, as he did. And he said, I just don't understand at all. I had a dream last night, and in my dream, I don't remember reaching down and tapping either one of you on the shoulder. So I figured with characters like that, the Texas story was something that I needed to pursue. And I have always felt, I'm from Oregon, I'm a Westerner, And I have always felt that the West gets undervalued in accounts of American history. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that there are probably more graduate programs of history within 200 miles of New York City or Boston or the East Coast than in the entire rest of the country. And so it is perfectly acceptable to write a dissertation on the evolution of one New England town. And that's considered legitimate American history. If you do the same sort of thing regarding a town in Texas or a pueblo in Southern California, that's often considered kind of provincial. So I thought that it was important to rectify this imbalance, this Eastern tilt in American history. And so when I got to Texas in the early 1980s, I began listening very carefully to these Texas stories, and I decided that this was a story that I wanted to try to understand, first of all, and to try to tell. So I worked on Texas history. I wrote a book on Texas history. I was invited out to Midland, and the first question that was posed to me after this research that I had done, Professor Brands, what was Sam Houston's middle name? I was utterly nonplussed. What are you going to do with that? And as far as I knew, Sam Houston had no middle name. A whole lot of people back in Sam Houston's day didn't have a middle name. But I certainly wasn't going to tell that 7th grade class that. So, thinking fast, I said. And of course, those of us in the teaching business take every opportunity to seize on these teaching moments. And so I said, his middle name, now this is a very good question. We might take the name that he adopted or was given by the Cherokees. Now, did you know that Sam Houston lived with the Cherokees when he was about your age? This was a middle school audience. Oh, yes, yes. You know, he was called the Raven by the Cherokees. We could use that as his middle name. Or you probably remember, and I tried to flatter their intelligence, you probably remember that when Sam Houston came to Texas, like all of the other American immigrants to Texas, he was supposed to be baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. And so he took a saint's name, Pablo. And in fact, he sometimes did sign contracts and he signed his name, Samuel Pablo Houston. So we could use that as his middle name. And by the time I finished that, I was looking for the door, hoping I could get out. Okay, well, that's sort of how I came to the study of Texas history. But I have to caution you that what you're going to hear this morning is a talk that I was going to give at the San Jacinto Day celebration 5 years ago. My book on Texas history had recently come out, and they were kind enough to give me the invitation to come. And I said, sure, I'll be happy to come. And I was going to tell them, well, what I was going to say is that, and I'm not even, I guess I have the nerve to tell this group. I will assume that this is an audience of open-minded people who want to be challenged on some of the cherished notions. But I also have to pay attention to who's hosting the event. Anyway, I'll just go ahead and get it out. I'm going to tell you that the Battle of San Jacinto was not the big deal the Texans think it was. Yeah, you see? And I'm also going to tell you why I didn't have the nerve to say that standing in front of the San Jacinto Memorial. Well, it was partly because when I was tendered the invitation, I was under the assumption that I would get to speak for the equivalent of an academic hour, about 50 minutes or so. And so I had my remarks all figured out, and I wanted to develop this argument. But then, as I looked at the program, it was clear that I was just one of several people on the program. Not everybody had come just to hear me. And then there were all the sorts of patriotic celebrations and surroundings, and I started to lose my nerve there because this probably isn't such a good idea at this particular time and place. And then I was told, and this was something that I was told just before I went on, oh yes, we have our San Jacinto rule as to how long the speaker gets to speak. And the rule is that when you're speaking at San Jacinto Day, you do not get to speak any longer than the Battle of San Jacinto itself lasted. So there went 2/3 of my speech, but I made a silent promise to myself that the next time I agreed to speak on any battlefield, it was going to be at Gettysburg, which lasted 3 days. But the last thing that really caused, oh yeah, well then there was the other thing too. That the speech, I was going to speak at a podium like this with the monument behind me and television cameras from the Houston stations in front of me. And I could just see the lead on the 11 or 10 o'clock news where the cameras are panning up at me and it's going to be Yankee professor disses San Jacinto. Because it was on the north side of the monument. And you know, the story of the battle and all that is etched. I often tell my students that when they're worried about turning in a paper or something like that, don't worry, it's not etched in stone. Well, in this case, the story was etched in stone in letters this tall, and it says, right behind where I was speaking, the Battle of San Jacinto is one of the monumental battles in all of human history. So, who are you going to believe? The Yankee professor or what's written on the monument up there? Okay, anyway. But in fact, I do have the nerve this morning, and I'm going to tell you why. The Battle of San Jacinto is overrated. Okay? Hold on. Now, but before I get there, that's going to be the punchline. I have to lead up to all of this. In any big event in human history, there are various ways of explaining what's going on. There are sort of big explanations that transcend particular individuals. If you want to explain something like the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution was something that touched the lives of tens of millions of people, in which tens of millions of people took part. There are very few individuals that you could imagine somehow being erased from the historical record, and that erasure having much effect on changing the course of the Industrial Revolution. There are things like that. The emergence of democracy. I was just speaking to my class at the University of Texas, day before yesterday, on the question of, is democracy the wave of the future? And we examined this question, how in 1800 there weren't any practicing democracies in the world, and in 2000 there are 120, or depending on how you count them. And so democracy certainly seems to be gaining ground. So here's a big event that unfolded over 200 years. There are those big kinds of history, but there are also momentous events in history that turn on the actions of a handful of people. And one of the striking things to me about the Texas Revolution is precisely that. The armies involved. For somebody like me, who first thought about war in the context of World War II, when you're dealing with armies of tens of millions of people, to look at the Texas Revolution and realize you're talking about an army of less than 1,000 on Houston's side and a few thousand on the side of Santa Anna and the Mexicans, and how a group of people that could fit into this room could actually change history. Well, in fact, that's the way it turned out. And as I was trying to understand the Texas Revolution, it occurred to me that there are two individuals that are really central to understanding the way things unfolded. Now, there's no big surprise in their identities. One is Stephen Austin, the other is Sam Houston. Now, maybe it's because I came to Texas history from the study of American history, but I found parallels to those individuals in the Texas Revolution from other fields of history. Sam Haynes is going to talk to us more about the connection between the Texas Revolution and 1776. But maybe because I had written a book about Benjamin Franklin, it occurred to me that Stephen Austin was the Benjamin Franklin of Texas history. Now, not in a lot of ways. In fact, one can find probably more differences between Austin and Franklin than similarities. But there's one crucial similarity, it seems to me, to explain the origins of the Texas Revolution. And this begins with what I take as a premise, but it's a premise based on my experience and study of history. Most people are not revolutionaries. Most people just want to live their lives, be left more or less alone. And if allowed to do it, they will. Stephen Austin was somebody who was like that. Stephen Austin was the most important figure in Mexican Texas. And both those words are critical to understanding Austin's role in Texas history, because Austin left the United States in the early 1820s, emigrating to a foreign country. When he initially left, it was Spanish Texas, but by the time he got to San Antonio, it was Mexican Texas. And he was an emigre. He was an expatriate, and he intended to live the rest of his life in a foreign country, except that the foreign country became his home country. Stephen Austin was almost a charter citizen of the Mexican Republic. He arrived in Texas the moment of Mexican independence, and he took a very great interest in the development of Mexican politics, and of course including Texas politics. He wrote suggestions as to what the Mexican Constitution ought to include. Moreover, his success as the colonizer, the impresario of Texas, depended on Texas remaining part of Mexico, because Austin was the go-between. Those American colonists who came from the United States to Texas needed Austin to act as the intermediary between them and the Mexican government. And Austin, I don't know if he thought about this consciously. He must have, in part because the reason he went to Texas was to redress the family debt, to make some money and dig himself out of the hole that his father had gotten the family in. And he needed that business model to continue. Austin was one of those people who did not want Texas to be independent. Not until the very end. Austin had every reason to want Texas to continue as part of Mexico. If Texas was part of Mexico, Austin was a great man. If Texas became independent or part of the United States, nobody would need Stephen Austin. And he would be superseded by the next generation of leadership, which indeed is what happened in the last months of his life. But it was for this reason that Austin was one of the last defenders of Santa Anna and the Mexican government, even after he'd spent a year and a half in prison in Mexico City. He thought that the tie between Texas and Mexico could and should persist. But it was only when Santa Anna utterly tore up the Mexican Constitution and began to usurp powers from Texans and from the other states of Mexico that Austin came to believe that the rights of Texans and his own future were no longer secure under the Mexican government. Now, you're probably wondering what this has to do with Benjamin Franklin. Well, in fact, Benjamin Franklin was in quite an analogous position with respect to the American colonies and their relationship to the British Empire. Benjamin Franklin was the great American in the British Empire. He had a brilliant career as a British subject. He was the most famous member of his generation. And he would have been delighted for the American colonies to remain part of the British Empire. But the British pushed things too far, until finally he said, enough is enough. Now, to me, somebody like Franklin and somebody like Austin is a bellwether of revolution. These are people who were disposed to favor continued connection. In the one case between the American colonies in Britain, in the other case between Texas and Mexico. When they were finally pushed so far as to say, we've got to cut the tie, then in essence, it was all over. Because if Franklin said enough to the British, well, that was a pretty good indication that a critical mass in the American colonies agreed with that position. The same thing with respect to Austin. When Austin said, enough is enough, we must go for independence, then that was a clear marker that Texans as a group had said, enough is enough. Okay, that's Stephen Austin. Sam Houston was an entirely different character with an entirely different agenda. Sam Houston did not want to go to Texas. Sam Houston wanted to stay in Tennessee and to go to Washington. Sam Houston was talked about as the protege, the heir apparent of Andrew Jackson. He was the rising son of Tennessee at a time when Andrew Jackson had essentially seized Washington, taken Washington by storm. Houston was governor of Tennessee. Jackson was president of the United States. Jackson at that time was the oldest person to occupy the White House. People naturally were wondering who's going to be next in line. It looked as though the West was the source of American politicians because the West was growing in importance, the West was growing in political influence, and naturally people looked to Sam Houston, who had just about everything a politician, a rising candidate, could want on his resume. He was smart, he was ambitious, he was handsome, he was a war hero, and he had the favor of Andrew Jackson. The only thing he didn't have was a wife. He needed a wife. Then, as now, family values matter. And so Houston was advised, Sam, you got to find yourself a wife. And so he let it be known that he was eligible. And he found a bride in Eliza Allen of Tennessee. And people looked at the two of them, the handsome Houston, the beautiful Eliza, and they said, this is a great match. It's a great match personally. It's a wonderful love story. And boy, these two are going to go far politically. You probably know the story, however, about how the marriage fell apart within just weeks. And no one quite understood why. Partly because each side, or more precisely the defenders of each side, told stories that tended to favor their own side. As a historian, I often wish that historians could have sort of like an Aladdin's lamp, where you could rub it and you get 3 wishes. And the wishes for the historians would be 3 moments in time when I could flash back and be a fly on the wall to figure out why something happened, something really critical, but there is not enough evidence to be able to say exactly why it happened. Now, this might sound very weird, so you'll forgive me, but one of these moments in history would be the wedding night of Sam and Eliza. What happened? Various stories have been told. There are stories that when Sam Houston was fighting under Andrew Jackson during the run-up to, well, during the War of 1812, but in the war against the Creeks in the southeastern part of the United States, Houston took part in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And he was wounded, as the descriptions of the day said rather delicately, in the upper thigh. Well, there were stories that suggested that this interfered with Houston's ability to be a good husband to Eliza. These are probably belied by Houston's later marriage and the children that he had, but nonetheless, there were those who said that it was Houston's fault. There were others who said that no, it was Eliza's fault, and that Sam Houston discovered something on his wedding night that, well, caused him to have a different view of Eliza. Probably the best explanation, and this is one that comes from the various threads of, and I'll admit, ambiguous evidence, is that Houston discovered that Eliza loved someone else, and that she had been talked into the engagement and the wedding by her ambitious parents. And Houston, being, I think, the utter romantic that he was, couldn't bear that she had to be married to someone she didn't love. So, she went back to her parents. He abandoned the governorship of Tennessee, and fled to the west, and spent the next 3 years roaring drunk, drowning his sorrows, drowning his memories, drowning everything else. There's one account of, he was living in Arkansas, what was then Indian Territory, and it was illegal for traders, and he supported himself more or less by engaging in trade with the Indians. And it was illegal for the traders to import liquor to sell to the Indians. And Houston was caught with 9 large barrels of whiskey. But he beat the rap by explaining, apparently convincingly, that it was all for his personal consumption. Anyway, Houston left this trail of shame and humiliation behind him. And no one was more puzzled, ashamed of his protege than Andrew Jackson. Because Jackson had essentially adopted Sam Houston, thinking Houston was the brightest, the most promising of the proteges that Jackson had. And then he heard this story that Houston had overthrown the governorship and had gone off on this multiple-year bender. Houston wrote letters to Jackson in which he bemoaned his fate. I don't know if any of you have had the experience of talking to someone only to realize that this person is drunk. You can pick up on the cues and the bloodshot eyes and the smell of alcohol in the breath if you're doing it in person. I don't know if you've ever had this experience talking to someone on the telephone and suspecting maybe they've had a few too many. It does happen. Imagine, I don't know if you've ever seen this, reading a letter from somebody and realizing the person must have been drunk and writing the letter. These were the letters that Houston wrote to Jackson. And it was clear that he just rambles on and he circles back on all the other things he was going to say. Jackson was amazed. Jackson was sorely disappointed in Houston. And Houston heard that Jackson indeed was disappointed. So Houston decided he must regain his honor. He must regain the respect of Andrew Jackson. And the way he's going to do this is to do something really grand after the fashion, after the model of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was known as the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, yes indeed, but he was also the person who seized Florida for the United States. And Houston looked around and said, what could I do that's like this? He heard about all these people, especially from Tennessee, heading for Texas, and he says to himself, that's what I'm going to do. So we will flash forward to 1835, when there begins, or there culminates, this sentiment in Texas on behalf of independence. But Stephen Austin is lagging behind. And Sam Houston is the one who's at the head of the Independence Party. And there comes this moment when there is a change in leadership. Austin has been the one who has been leading the Americans in Texas, but he now is falling behind. Houston, in large part because he's so slow to embrace independence. Houston is the one who's been agitating in favor of independence. And when that balance point is reached, and sentiment in Texas tips towards independence, then Houston is the one that the Texans look to. But what are they looking to Houston for? Most of them are not looking to Houston for leadership to independence, because the vast majority of them are recent immigrants from the United States. What they're looking for is detachment from Mexico and attachment to the United States. Now, this brings us to the beginning of 1836. Houston is now the general-in-chief of the Texas Army, such as it is. It is very small. It's, I don't know how many people are in the room today, 200 maybe. Double that if you're lucky, and you got Houston's army. And with this, he was supposed to oppose the army of Santa Anna. Santa Anna, I would suggest that Santa Anna might well have been the most gifted military commander of the first half of the 20th century in North America. We could argue about this, but the way he handled the hand he was dealt, the way he played the hand he was dealt, the way he dealt with the circumstances confronting him were on many occasions no less than brilliant. Houston understood that in order for Texas to become, well, now again, Houston's not exactly aiming for independence from the United States. What he's aiming for is attachment between Texas and the United States. And it's this that shapes his strategy. Houston knows, oh, I said that Stephen Austin was the Benjamin Franklin of the Texas Revolution. Sam Houston, I would argue, was the George Washington of the Texas Revolution. George Washington in a particular sense. Do you know that George Washington lost nearly every battle he fought, except the last one? And that's the critical one. And do you know how he won the Battle of Yorktown? It was with the material, substantial, almost overwhelming help of the French Navy and of French soldiers on the ground. Washington knew that the question of the colonies, the American colonies, would not be settled until France and Britain had it out, because the French and the British had been fighting over North America for nearly 100 years. That was Houston's insight. Houston understood that the question of Texas would not be settled until Mexico and the United States had it out, because Mexico was the powerful country to the south and west, the United States was the powerful country to the north and east, and Texas was caught between these two powers. The future of Texas would not be decided, would not be secure until the U.S. and Mexico slugged it out. This was the basis for Houston's strategy during the War of the Texas Revolution, and it explains why Houston did not want to defend the Alamo. He thought that the Alamo was a waste of time, a waste of resources, a waste of blood, and furthermore, even if the Texans had been able to hold the Alamo, it would have been a net disadvantage. He simply didn't have enough troops to defend the Alamo and leave those troops at the Alamo. That would deprive him of 100, 200, 300, however many people were in the garrison. It's why Houston conspicuously did not go to the assistance of the garrison at the Alamo. Houston, like George Washington, understood that the Texas Revolution would not be won in an afternoon or a morning, but it could be lost in a morning or an afternoon. And he understood that if he had sent his army to the Alamo, the army would have been wiped out, and that would have been the end of the Texas Revolution. Like Washington, Washington knew that when you're the home team, all you have to do is stay in the game, because the visitors, sooner or later, will get tired and go home. The visitors in the American Revolution were the British. The visitors in the Texas Revolution were the Mexicans. So Houston retreats across Texas, east and east and east, to the outrage of his soldiers, who tended toward mutiny anyway. They didn't like being told what to do. They didn't like the fact that Santa Anna was beating up, killing their comrades at the Alamo at Goliad. They were itching for a fight. And Houston had not shared his strategy with them. What was his strategy? His strategy was precisely to involve the United States in the battle for Texas. Houston knew that Andrew Jackson had a novel interpretation of the border of Texas. Now, the Mexican government and most of the world contended that the border between the United States and Texas and Mexico, Mexican Texas, was the Sabine River, which is where everybody else thought it was. But Andrew Jackson, being the expansionist that he was, contended that the Neches River was in fact the western branch of the Sabine River. And therefore, the territory between the two rivers was actually American soil. And Houston realized what an opportunity this provided for him and the Texas Army, because he knew perfectly well that Santa Anna contended, as everyone else did, that Mexico went clear to the Sabine. So Houston was going to draw Santa Anna, was going to retreat clear across Texas, across the Trinity, across the Neches, into this disputed region. And he knew that Edmund Gaines, the U.S. commanding officer for western Louisiana, had a small army there. It didn't have to be a big army, but the point was that it was an American army, and that if Houston could draw Santa Anna into the disputed strip, then an engagement would take place between Mexican forces and U.S. forces. And to pull a phrase from 10 years later, American blood would be shed on American soil. Houston didn't know exactly that that's how the final chapter of the Texas Revolution would play out in the battle for the strip between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. Again, a disputed strip. Most of the world thought that Texas ended at the Nueces. But James Polk, who happened to be an heir of Andrew Jackson, said, no, no, it goes all the way down to the Rio Grande, and we will fight for that disputed strip. Houston didn't know that's the way things were going to play out. But he did sense that that was what was going to have to happen before the Texas Revolution would end. This was the strategy. This was the plan. And it would have worked. How do I know it would have worked? Well, it worked in 1846. And an American president, an expansion-minded American president, would have found it irresistible to then declare war on Mexico. And what happened in 1846 would have happened in 1836. But it didn't play out that way. And it didn't play out that way because Houston was a lousy leader. Well, that might not be right. His army were lousy followers. They didn't want to go east. They wanted to fight. And they took that crucial turn a few days before the Battle of San Jacinto. And Houston at least had the insight to realize, hey, if you're going to be a leader and your army's going that way, you better run around and get in front of him. And so he did. And he was smart enough then and later not to blab about what the original strategy was. And when the Battle of San Jacinto turned out positively, then he could claim to be the victor of San Jacinto. But he also knew that that didn't end the question of what's going to happen to Texas. It didn't end the Texas Revolution. Yes, indeed, the captured Santa Anna signed treaties turning over Texas and granting Texas independence. But everybody knew that by then Santa Anna had been deposed. He couldn't speak for anybody. He had enough enemies back in Mexico City who were happy to give him a push, but treaties signed under duress with a gun at your head don't bind anybody to anything. Houston understood this, which was one of the reasons that he was so interested in getting Texas annexed to the United States, because Texas's Mexican problem had to become America's Mexican problem. That was the only security for Texas. Now, I have to chuckle, being an outsider, at how attached Texans are to that period of the Texas Republic, because it was not something almost anybody at the time wanted to have happen. It was making the best of being jilted by the United States, because, as you know, Texas applied for admission to the United States, and the U.S. said, no, forget it. And so for the next 9 years, Texans had to figure out how to get along on their own. And we know the story of the Texas Republic and how Texas was not even able to defend itself against embarrassing invasions by the Mexican army, which reoccupied San Antonio. And it wasn't until 1846, after annexation, after Texas's Mexican problem became America's Mexican problem, and after Zachary Taylor, playing the role of Sam Houston, took his forces into that disputed region, and after that sort of suckered the Mexicans into attacking, thereby triggering the war between the United States and Mexico that Houston had intended all along. So, that's my long-winded way of explaining why, I'm sorry, but San Jacinto, it wasn't that big a deal. Oh, I guess I should say one last thing on this subject, and that is, it's a fundamental principle of war that the war isn't over till the loser says it's over. Winners can say it's over easy enough, but the side that's losing has to say, okay, that's enough. And Mexico didn't say that. Santa Anna did, but he wasn't speaking for Mexico at that point. And Mexico continued to claim authority, sovereignty over Texas, which was why it took finally a war between the United States and Texas to resolve the issue. There, I've said it. I'm the skunk at the garden party. I'll try to answer any. Do we have time for questions?
We have time for maybe one, and then we'll have a longer session in the afternoon.
Okay. Does anybody want to ask a question at this point? Yes, sir.
You
want to repeat that for the mic?
The question was, did I ever find out his real middle name? Well, aside from being so flattered to receive the invitation to come here this morning, that was my ulterior motive. I'm still trying to find out the answer. If you got the answer, let me know.
Would you give $100 for it?
No, but I'm tempted. I'm tempted to offer $100 for something else, and that is that clause in either the ordinance, the resolution of annexation, or any of the other documents that says that Texas has a right to secede from the United States. Thank you very much.